My name is Chloe Sampson. I'm a public relations student here at NSCC. My classmates and I are moderating the event here today. So if you have any comments or ideas that you would like to share with the minister, please flag one of us down and we can bring you the microphone, or you can hand us your comment card. So if you guys could just raise your hands at the back there, just point them out there. So our first comment today has come from Twitter. It says, Nova Scotia has one of the smallest deficits in Canada. The sky is not falling.
I think I made reference to this in my opening comments. I juxtaposed us to Newfoundland, 2 billion versus 240 million. There are other jurisdictions, again, with large deficits, Alberta, Saskatchewan. These are jurisdictions, though, where if you watch and you look at the Alberta, you hear the expression the boom and bust, and we're in the bust portion of that cycle. When those commodity and the oil and gas prices come down, when your economy is tied to it so closely, clearly you're going to be suffering because you were planning at a higher amount of revenue, and well, that revenue doesn't materialize, but you've already committed to the spending. So of course you're going to be anticipating, and it takes some time to readjust your spending to your revenues. But the other thing with those jurisdictions is that you have a tendency to see the rebound as well. So that example ignores the significant surpluses that those other jurisdictions had over the good years. Nova Scotia's economy doesn't look like that. If you were to look at the economic line, you see the surpluses in the boom years and the deficits in the bust years. There are certain jurisdictions where big peaks, big valleys. And Nova Scotia is bumping along here. We don't get major rebounds. But as I said earlier, 20 of the last 30 years have been deficits. That means out of 20 out of 30 years, every 2 out of 3 years, we spend more money than we take in. That's the problem. I didn't say the sky is falling. I said that we are not and have not historically been making good decisions moving towards fiscal sustainability. And to say, well, you're not as bad as another jurisdiction in this one year, that's not the same conversation that I'm having. It's comparing apples and oranges. I'm talking about the long-term viability of Nova Scotia, and that's the path I think we should be on.
We have a question from the audience here.
Yeah, hi. Is this on? Is it on?
There you are.
Yeah, okay, thanks, sorry. Hi, my name's Stella Lord. I'm with the Community Society to End Poverty in Nova Scotia. So I have a question about the provincial welfare rates. Provincial welfare rates have been frozen since your government came into office in 2013. The Minister of Community Services has indicated that last year that there is unlikely to be an increase in this year's budget either. This despite the fact that according to Statistics Canada, food price increased overall by 2.3% in 2014 and by another 3.7% in 2015. That's a total increase of 6% since January 2014. Fresh fruit and vegetables, which nutritionists and the Provincial Thrive programme argue should be a larger component of a healthy diet, increased by 9.7% and 5.7% respectively. On top of food price increases, there have also been increases in shelter costs and for other necessities. How is it that the government can provide generous royalty refunds to Exxon, money to help vineyard and wine producers, who appear to be doing very well on their own, thank you very much, and nearly 1.5 million in payroll tax rebates to Oxford Foods, and another 59 million to 15 other Nova Scotia companies. But you cannot even spend 25 million to help the 42,000 people on income assistance to put bread on the table. Will your government increase welfare payments in this upcoming budget to cover the increases in food cost and shelter costs since 2013?
Thank you for your question. And as I'd mentioned earlier, in terms of where the government wants to go and the importance of investing in Nova Scotians, again, I think I've made that clear in terms of what we want to be able to do, but also the challenge we have in being able to do it. In comparing the, for example, payroll rebates around the economic development side of things, that's the quandary. If you start citing, a payroll rebate where you see something in the vicinity between 7 and 9% of the salaries, income tax, being rebated back to an organization, that is a scenario where we're trying to incent economic development. As I'd mentioned earlier, we need to see that. We need to see those people working so that we generate the income tax, so we have the money at our disposal to invest in the programs and services that are really our core objectives in government. Again, those priorities very clearly, which are demonstrated in the sequence of spending. We've got healthcare, education, and community services are the three main areas where government spends. And so that is a reflection of the revenue we take in. When there are specific decisions, like I said, around the economic development side, that is one of the things we have to do to support economic development and see growth to increase our revenue. Because again, I mentioned our tax rates are already the highest in the country. We have the highest top tax bracket on income tax. We have the highest with our HST at 15% is the highest jurisdiction in the country. Increasing rates is not a way for us to get new revenue, to have opportunities to invest in new programs and services. As far as your specific question about what is going to be in the budget, that and for anyone else is not something that I'll be answering in terms of any of the questions today. The take your feedback, certainly that, and I'll interpret it this way, that you would like to see the government increase the investment in the community services space for low-income people. And I take that because this is the consultation portion where we received all of the ideas and submissions from Nova Scotians that we review through the process and then make our decisions that go into the budget. So this is not about presenting what's in the budget up front, but about engaging Nova Scotians. So I can indicate that I've heard that is, I believe what you would say your submission would be is you want to see increased rates there. And so that's noted, and we'll take forward as part of our finalizing the budget. Okay.
Question from the audience. What are the 6 major challenges facing Canadian small businesses?
6. Yeah. I don't know if I'll list them off as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think if you're talking about Canadian small businesses, we're getting a bit outside of my purview and jurisdiction. So I'd like to narrow that scope down to a Nova Scotian context, and also add the caveat that I'm the Minister of Finance, not the Minister of Business. So we do have a minister who is responsible for engaging and working with our business leaders directly, and that's where his department's role and focus is. So with those caveats, I think what I hear from Nova Scotia businesses and organizations representing them, CFIB, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, for example, they speak often and they present information often that some of their challenges are things that I've already noted. They highlight that the tax rates in a Nova Scotia context that they identify. They identify red tape. The process, so when you have to file forms for licenses or programs, or you have to subject your organization to inspections and all of that administrative work that you do with government, they see those as burdens. And again, I'm speaking from the position of a business, and that's something that we recognize as a government. And last year, we made some major structural changes. We created a new Office of Regulatory Affairs with a mandate and a focus to work with all departments in business, to all departments in government, to assess and identify where we have regulations. Let's keep in mind, and I want to respect government in the process, that regulations exist and they generally were created for a purpose. And so for every regulation that you look at and you point at and you say you don't like it, in many instances it was created for a reason. But what we don't always do is go back and say, is that reason still relevant today? So a regulation that may have been created 20 or 30 years ago, is it still relevant in today's environment? Can it be done more efficiently as a regulation? And there are opportunities to improve processes and efficiencies and things like that. So from a small business and government side of things, I think the main concerns that I've been hearing are really about the cost of doing business, in the sense of, certainly taxes, but I think if I ask Nova Scotians, they too would say taxes, because nobody likes to give the money to the government when they could keep it in their pocket. But that's the challenge we have, because the government needs money from the citizens to pay for the programs and services that citizens also want and need. And then the red tape side, if we can improve that efficiency, and again, we've already initiated some of that, and the Office of Regulatory Affairs just got up and running within the last year. So we're seeing improvements there. And I think it's also worth noting that in Nova Scotia, again, the CFIB has done, they do intermittent surveys of their membership across the country, and one of the things they've noted is confidence of small businesses for their future is the highest in Nova Scotia across the country. So we have a lot of confidence. So I think the decisions and the changes we've been making around economic development and red tape reduction have been received well. So while challenges exist, we're taking steps that I think are positive steps that will pay dividends for Nova Scotia.
Comment is from Twitter. 1 year ago, government released a budget that deregulated tuition fees and threw post-secondary education into chaos.
So just to clarify what took place around the tuition fees, the change that took place was acknowledging that the point in time when the government locked in and capped tuition increases, that the time that took place, there was no effort. So if I go just before that took place, universities were competing in an open market where they would set their tuition prices as they saw fit. And, for competitive reasons, some universities may have charged lower tuition to increase their number of students, and other universities may have had higher tuition for the same program and service. That's the way the market system works. Then a government came in and locked those tuitions in and capped the potential for increases. What's been ignored in the conversation is how that disadvantaged some institutions, and thereby the students that attended those institutions. If an institution started at a lower rate of tuition for similar programs and services, or similar program, and someone else was locked in at a higher rate, and each and every year where you can only increase at 3%, 3% of a higher number is a higher amount of dollars. So even with all of the pressures within those institutions, year over year as they were capped, those institutions that were locked in at a lower rate were being disserviced, and thus also the students that attended those institutions in their ability to receive comparable programs and services that a sister institution would be providing. So what was done was, in an effort to bring in fairness and balance to the system, was to allow the institutions the opportunity to look around and set their rates, if they're providing the same programs and services, to align with the other institutions. But the cap beyond that remains in place.
We have another question from the audience.
Welcome. Thank you for coming to our campus today. I encourage our students, by the way, please ask him questions. This is probably the first time most of you have ever been in a room with a Minister of Finance, so go ahead and ask him. On the expense side, has there corporations and families, people sometimes go to a zero budget. They just basically blow up the whole thing and start over again. Have you given any thought to really just looking at, even bringing in some external help and just going to a zero-based budget and starting, the 40% that goes to service the debt you can't get rid of, you might be able to work it a bit, but is there a way to restart this thing? Because demographically, we're on a path that's really headed to nowhere. And so I just wonder if on the expense side, on the revenue side I have a few ideas, but on the expense side, can our government look at maybe restarting some of the areas?
I think, in theory, and it was mentioned in my intro that's where I came from, so I love theoretical questions and approaches. It could yield some interesting results. Practically, it gets more complicated and problematic than that, and it does for a number of reasons, including, when I talk about change or structural change, and if you look at, the past two budgets that our government has brought forward to Nova Scotians, we've made some difficult decisions. We've changed programs, and we've tweaked programs, and, people who are impacted by those changes don't respond positively, obviously. So if we were to start from a zero-sum game, I think it would be challenging rolling something like that out, not to mention practically to start there and work through while still delivering all of our programs and services. And I think that's part of the reason why the system evolves and operates that way, is because we're still have to continue to provide our programs and services. We can't kind of start zero-sum. From a theoretical perspective, can you do it as an exercise and say, where would things line up and help align? That, I think, ties more into our policy and how you're setting policy. But I think, again, engaging with Nova Scotians, hearing from Nova Scotians, which areas do we think we need to work with and focus on? And again, the resources that would have to go in such an exercise would be quite extensive as well.
This question is from the audience. Do you think the incoming Syrian refugees will make an impact on Nova Scotia's economy?
Yeah, I do. If I use my own jurisdiction in Antigonish, we have a couple of privately sponsored families that have already arrived. I think there's efforts to support a couple of more. And I think of one family in particular has been quite engaged with the community already. One of the individuals, I believe 22 or 23 years old, had been studying at the University of Damascus as a medical student. He's looking forward to getting his application in to Dalhousie, and if he has to upgrade his skills, he's to get into the program there. So we have these opportunities with these families. His father had a chocolate factory. He's expressed interest as an entrepreneur to get involved and engaged with some work and initiatives in the province. One of the other families, skilled individuals, a welder, I believe, in one of the families. He's been out in the community looking for opportunities to assess his skill level to get the appropriate certifications and so on. So I think they're coming in with the interest to participate and get involved in the economy and can have those benefits.
With healthcare costs of over 41%, can the Nova Scotia government negotiate with large drug companies in cooperation with the federal government and other interested jurisdictions to reduce drug costs?
Yeah, I think there's often efforts. So that would be an area where my counterpart, my colleague, the Minister of Health, when meeting with his provincial, territorial, and federal counterparts, would have discussions like that. And I think you've seen where changes like efforts around generic drug prices and things that have been done in the past, and so I think they're always looking for opportunities to improve the efficiencies of the system, and where those opportunities can be done. I think people look for them, and but again, negotiations are negotiations, and you need to get all parties to come to an agreement through that.
This question is from Ken Brown of the Seniors Commission. What program or service would you not want to give up?
So that's asking me the question that I'm asking you? Listen, it's a difficult question, which is why I put it up there as to a particular program or service. I'll start by saying I won't answer the question, and only because it is the virtue of my role and what I'm doing through the process. I'm here consulting. I don't want my position on that to bias anyone else's position on what their thoughts are when they're making their submissions. So I appreciate the question, and I certainly do put my own thought towards those very questions. But the other thing in my role that I want to clarify too is I am a citizen of the province, but I am one citizen. So I have, my own unique circumstances that every other citizen and their families have. I have a young family that's different than some of the other people sitting in the room. So the nature of the programs and services that I, as a citizen, would be most interested in may be different than other Nova Scotians. And, for that reason, my personal thought on programs and services for me as a citizen isn't relevant where I'm here as the Minister of Finance, in which case I have to take into consideration the views of all Nova Scotians as we're going through the budgeting process. So my personal views on those represent one citizen, whereas my job mandates me to make the efforts and make decisions on behalf of all Nova Scotians, and I do my best to maintain that separation. So again, respectfully, I think it was a great question, but I won't answer specifically for those reasons.
Considering the structural changes you suggest we need to make, is the government considering privatizing the Registry of Motor Vehicles as an attempt to save on its costs? And what protection will Nova Scotians have against increased user fees if privatized?
I believe this is a topic that the Minister and so Service Nova Scotia, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia, has already publicly spoken about that they're looking at or have reached out to explore the question of alternate service delivery models. In other words, asking the question, we are providing programs and services in a particular way. Is there an opportunity to provide them in a different way? I think he's been very clear that if they were to pursue an initiative that would change the structure of the delivery of service, that things like the cost or the fee program, the ownership of data, that those would be things that would continue to reside with government.
Why doesn't the government lead by example and cut their own generous salaries and benefits to show the public that they are serious?
Sure. Perhaps this may come as a surprise to people, but when we come into office, in fact, an independent panel actually reviews our compensation. For when we came in, so I was first elected in the fall of 2013 in the last general election. So, some point after that, the committee was struck. I think three or four people were on it. They came back with the direction as to what that compensation program and structure would look like, and then that gets adopted. But one of the things we did do is we did freeze our salaries. We did lead by example. We're having conversations and negotiations with employees in the public sector, and the very first thing we did was froze our own salaries. So we've been operating with frozen salaries essentially since we came in, and we maintained that before we engaged in negotiations or conversations with labor, with other groups, and that's a frozen salary. We didn't flag potential increases down the line, which in tentative agreements that are out there and offers do have some increases over the life of the contract. So I do think we have been leading by example in that regard.
This question was over email. The federal government is spending its way to prosperity while your government is cutting. How can both work? Doesn't spending make more sense?
Yeah, two things I want to clarify, maybe three, before I'm done. The first is the statement that we're cutting. Go back and look at our expenditures. We're not cutting, we're controlling. We're controlling the growth. We're not allowing our expenditures to grow at the rate they had been growing. That's very different from cutting. You know, to that previous question about leading by example, about cut our own compensation and so on, we've made it very clear. We were not looking to cut salaries of the public service. We were looking to ensure that the growth and rate of growth in increases was sustainable and matches our ability to pay. Now, there may be a particular program or service that may change, that may see reductions, or may even end up being eliminated. So you may look at a program and say that program has been cut. But when you look at the overall budget and the spending of the government, it's increased. As I said earlier, it's about priorities. If we're going to create or invest in new programs or expand existing programs, the money has to come from somewhere. So, to go back to that question about why cut somewhere or cuts, we're not cutting. You know, some people have been describing it, and at a previous session, I think they asked about our austerity budgets. We're not cutting, we're controlling. And we're recognizing that we're aligning in our efforts to align the spending on programs and services that Nova Scotians want with our ability to pay. That's what we've been doing. Now, that may mean that we have to, if we want to expand a program or service over here, it may have to come from a program or service over there. And again, as I've mentioned earlier, in the absence of some windfall, sustainable windfall of money, what alternative do you have if we want to be sustainable? Now, the easy decision would be to just continue the expanding on the side and not managing on the other side. And it goes back similarly to the approach that I've mentioned earlier about regulations. Going back and questioning when we have a program or service. Like I said with regulations, it was created at a point in time with a purpose. It's incumbent on governments to go back from time to time and say, does that purpose still exist? And equally important to say, is that program or service and the money that's being spent on it achieving that purpose? So the purpose or the need may still exist, but in the given program or service, is it achieving the objective? Those are the important questions that we are asking ourselves, myself and my colleagues, as we go through the process. And based on the information we have, we make the best decisions we can based on that to align those things. And the other piece about matching us with the federal government versus ourselves, you have to recognize also the different economic realities of a federal government versus the provincial government. As I mentioned earlier about the economic realities and the boom and bust cycles, the federal government revenue streams comes from all Canadians, which means they have the opportunities. There's booms and busts. If you go back a number of years, when the oil and gas and the dollar were appreciating, you were seeing certain jurisdictions like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland seeing rapid growth in their economies. You're seeing other jurisdictions, primarily manufacturing related, like Ontario, where they were seeing the reverse because the negative impact of the high Canadian dollar. And we're starting to see the reverse of that. So because they have more diversity at the broad Canadian side of things, the impacts, they have mitigating, right? So as they're seeing some declines here, they're seeing some increase here. Nova Scotia, as I said, we just kind of plug along. So the capacity for the federal government to respond to the economic challenging times that are faced, to have the resources available to invest heavily on a national scale, they have. The other thing to remember about the national situation is our federal government made significant, difficult financial decisions back in the 1990s that set them up to be in a position where they can fiscally respond. And when we're talking about getting ourselves as a province to fiscal sustainability, that too, if we were in a fiscally sustainable position, we would be in a better position and have more resources available to have even higher levels of spending for short-term economic stimulus as the feds are looking at. So I just want to recognize that there are different economic realities.
Are booming in real estate. How does our real estate sector compare to the other two provinces?
I'm actually not sure. So that's not a level that I have recent detailed data on in terms of the specifics. But if the person who asked the question wants to either email it in or if they want to just leave their name on the card, I can certainly get back to you.
From a perspective of needing to earn more revenue and paying back our deficit, wouldn't it make sense to tax the 1% instead of attempting to manage and control the rest?
Yeah, so two things. I just want to clarify a technical point in that question. It said about reducing our deficit and managing. I just want to clarify and make sure that people deficit versus the debt, right? The debt would be the loan. The deficit is on a given year. So the debt is what we've borrowed already. The deficit is in any given year how much our expenditures exceed our revenues. And generally to cover it, you are borrowing more money and adding to the debt. But as far as that note, I mean, I think our federal government has indicated that and their intentions to increase the top tax rate. As I've mentioned earlier, we are already taxing the top 1%. Our top tax bracket, that would be the bracket that affects the 1%, is already the highest in Canada. So we're already doing that. We've already pulled that lever. This, again, is one of the challenges. We've already pulled a lot of our levers in Nova Scotia. The easy solution, so to speak. What I'm left here in the situation we're in are the difficult ones. And I hope Nova Scotians, recognize and respect that and work with us as we go through the budgeting process and continue on this path, because our objectives are pure in our intentions and desire to, again, our main objective is providing those programs and services, those cores, health, education, our most vulnerable citizens. That's essentially what government exists for, and then the infrastructure as well to support the province. That's what we're here for. There are other things, of course, but those are the big ones, and they're reflected in the amount of money we spend on them.
You say that the government relies on the taxes paid by us to bring in revenue. If taxes were lower, would this not encourage individuals to spend more money, therefore increasing government revenue?
Yeah, so there's an economic question, and you will find economists on both sides of that equation. So if we accept that premise, that by lowering our tax rates, there would be more money available and people would spend the more money, so we would get it back through our consumption taxes, and that is a path. Even if we accepted that, the challenge we have in Nova Scotia today is the impact to our revenue on the reduction of income taxes is immediate. If you accept and you actually saw the economic side of it, it doesn't happen for the future. So that's even if you accept that economic approach and principle, there's a lag while we're already in a deficit situation. Again, if we were to establish ourselves and get to that point of fiscal sustainability where we could afford to have some reductions that could absorb then that reduction in revenue in the short term to see the positive outcomes down the road. That, again, is one of those reasons why if we want to get to a point where we have the flexibility to make those types of decisions and commitments on behalf of Nova Scotians, we need to move ourselves towards that fiscal sustainability. That sustainability gives us the flexibility to respond, and whether it's in, and we can make conscious decisions as to whether it is stimulus spending because of the circumstances, or if it's in reduction of taxes and so on, or increased investments in certain programs and services. But again, we have to recognize the reality we're in today and have been for the last number of decades. We are spending and consistently spend more than we take in. That's our starting point.
What is your government's short and long-term plan for replacement of the VG hospital?
That work is ongoing. I think the Minister of Infrastructure and the Minister of Health continue to work on that with the Health Authority and the respective stakeholders. So there is a lot of work ongoing, not at a position, and I'm certainly not in a position to comment on it. I'm not the lead on that project. Those would be those ministers and the work that they're doing. But I can assure you that there is a lot of active work. I think you see work being done here in Dartmouth, at Dartmouth General, with renovations and expansions in the hospital there, which can help provide some of the, when it's complete, services that allow then some of the pressure to be relieved and things like that. But again, as far as the full detailed plan, it would be more appropriate for the other ministers to comment.
How do you intend to support small and medium-sized businesses to encourage economic growth and population retention?
Well, I think we've already done a number of things. When we came in to government and we campaigned on this as one of our major platform commitments, was recognizing that the way that the province had performed economic development over, again, our last number of years, decades, wasn't working. Signing a check to attract a large business, I know the question is about small business, but to attract larger businesses in and industries was not providing long-term sustainable success to the province. If it was the means to success, one would expect that we would have a much more successful economy in the province of Nova Scotia. So we recognize the need to consider structural change. So what we've already done, we did this in the last budget. We had a Department of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism that existed in the last budget. We ended that department. That department was responsible for various stimulus and supports for, again, economic development, but they also had intermixed in there some community programming and supports. So when we ended the department, again, recognizing that if you assessed our economic growth while that department existed, back to my earlier point, sometimes you have to assess, are they meeting the objectives that they were created for? And if we're assessing it, we weren't seeing the results we wanted to. So by removing it, we took programs and services which we think were still important. So there were certain ones that were around community investments or cultural, social, moved those over to community, culture, and heritage. There were other programs like ones that, for those of you that are students here, that are around student summer employment and so on, moved over to labor and advanced education, because that is the department most closely aligned with understanding both the workforce, and that is employers, and the students. So they manage those programs now. And then the Department of Business and the Office of Regulatory Affairs were created to focus on things around policy and processes to create the environment, the governance environment in the province that is attractive to the business community. Because it's the business community that create the jobs, right? Most Nova Scotians get paid by a company, not by the province directly. Right? We're not the employer of them. There are many other employers. That's what we rely on. So they need to create the jobs. We need to create the environment for them to be successful. There's still stimulus. An earlier question made reference to payroll rebates. So there are still programs and incentives to try to attract new business and encourage existing businesses to expand and grow. We, again, trying to make it more efficient, put in programs for businesses in Nova Scotia Business Inc., so for attracting and expanding. If you're a new startup, the focus would be engaging with an organization called InnovaCore. So that's kind of your venture capital, entrepreneurship side of things. You would be going there to engage for supports. And if you're looking at, and this is a really critical part of what our different approach is saying it's not always about government saying this company or that company should be supported, but rather saying, when you do that, if we invest in company A, we don't necessarily have money to invest in company B. So in an effort to spur economic development, we've actually created an unlevel playing field potentially. Because if company A has gotten the support and they've gotten established, then it's harder for company B to come in. So we've created a new entity called Invest Nova Scotia. And that organization is designed to, and it is in place, arm's length from cabinet and from government, to assess proposals for industry development so that they're investing in industry, so that it doesn't matter whether it's company A or company B, if the initiative is good for the industry, all of the companies, and that particularly I think is opportunity for smaller businesses to get engaged in, and industry associations, and it encourages cooperation and collaboration amongst businesses in a given industry to, again, invest in Nova Scotia to spur the growth for the entire industry rather than individual companies. That's a major structural change in the thought process of how government approaches economic development. And again, we just got that established in the last budget. Invest Nova Scotia, for example, I think the board was only appointed in the fall, but it's underway. So these things, we've already made changes and are working through. And again, we're very, I believe small businesses are respecting that. Again, I mentioned earlier, CFIB's own studies, surveys of their membership, shows that small business confidence in Nova Scotia is the highest across the country. I think in the last two, I don't know if they do monthly or quarterly surveys, but I think the last two surveys, they've indicated that. So I think the changes we've been making are being well received by that community.
So this is your last question here. Do you think that Nova Scotia's deficit could realistically reach zero or at least become significantly smaller within the next 2 or 3 decades?
Yes, so again, if we're talking deficit, I have a mandate letter from the Premier which tells me that, yes, it is getting to zero. That's what my mandate is actually to balance the budget. So if we have a balanced budget, our deficit is zero. It is a challenging time for me to pursue that, and I can't do it alone. I need the support of my colleagues, representing all of the departments that provide programs and services to Nova Scotians. I need the support of the employees who provide programs and services to Nova Scotians to support me and my colleagues. And I need all Nova Scotians, from Cape Breton to Yarmouth to Amherst and everywhere in between, to support us as well. To recognize those messages that I've delivered today, to recognize that when you're asking for new money to go somewhere, in the absence of new revenue, what you're really asking us to do is to move money from somewhere else. And so if you're asking us, when we say, yes, you know what, that is the right priority and we are going to invest there, then it would be really helpful for the success of the province if you stood up and said, we agree with that, because someone else over here who says we disagree with it is certainly going to be standing up. So it's certainly, if you want to see that successful transition, the alternative is the status quo. The alternative is 2 out of every 3 years running deficits. The alternative is providing programs and services consumed today that we're asking our children and grandchildren to pay for. For those of you that are students here, again, just imagine what we could do in programs and services if we had even a portion of the $900 million that goes out the door in interest payments on our debt for programs and services that were consumed before you were born. So thank you all. I guess that was my closing comments, but...
Thank you very much for coming here today. If there's anything else you'd like to add.
No, I just want to thank everybody, whether it's online or in the room, for coming out, for asking the questions. I really appreciate the engagement. It is really important, particularly for it's important for me, for all Nova Scotians to be engaged. You may have noticed that the 3 public sessions that I've streamed online have all taken place at academic institutions. For me, that's very important, near and dear, in part because our youth are our future. And, I highlighted the challenge on the demographic side. if we're going to get out of this challenge, we do rely on our future. And we rely on our youth to be engaged. So I try to get out to engage our youth, to be part of the conversation, to encourage you to participate. And so I thank you for your time. I look forward again, and just a reminder for everyone, whether you're in the room or online, you can submit your recommendations and budget suggestions via email, Twitter, 140 characters or less, or multiple tweets, I guess. But email, other mediums, phone. You can see the full list if you go to novascotia.ca/budget. And we're collecting input for the remainder of the month. Thank you again.
Thank you, Minister Delory. I hope that today's questions and comments were valuable to you as you continue on your visits around the province. We sincerely appreciate you including us as one of your stops in what is a busy schedule, and for your responses to the many questions you brought forward today. It can't be an easy process, but it's certainly valuable. Thanks to all who attended today's important session. Your interest, time, and input is appreciated. Minister, on behalf of the college, we wish you all the best as you prepare for the 2016-17 budget and get ready for the spring sitting of the legislature and its introduction.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you all.